I see America not in the setting sun of a black night of despair. I see America in the crimson light of a rising sun, fresh from the burning creative hand of God, who have brought light where there was darkness, warmth where there was cold, and peace where there was only bloodshed. We're a powerful force for good. With faith and courage, we can take freedom's next step.
The United States of America has an advantage that no autocracy can match. Our combination of free enterprise, free minds, and free people.
So what kind of strength leads to peace and prosperity in 2022? Well, national strength obviously includes a robust economy, innovative diplomacy, trade policy that reflects our strategic interests, among other things.
And to me, it's making it clear to China that they can't violate the laws of territorial sovereignty is why Taiwan matters, because we want the Indo-Pacific to remain stable and free.
The people in Ukraine remain foremost on our minds. Russia poses an acute threat to the international system, as illustrated by its ongoing war of choice and its brutal tactics.
Even in times of challenge, our democracy is a powerful engine for its own renewal. So I will put the American system up against any other, and I'll do so with great pride and total confidence.
We've lighted the world with our inventions, gone to the aid of mankind wherever in the world there was a cry for help, journeyed to the moon and safely returned. So much has changed, and yet we stand together as we did 2 centuries ago.
Today's is the finest fighting force the world has ever known. There's no other military that's stronger, more capable, more experienced, or more innovative. But that's not a birthright. It's not guaranteed. We can't take it for granted in the 21st century. We have to earn it again and again.
It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing.
Thank you. Please be seated. Well, since we launched in 2013, the central theme of every Ronald Reagan National Defense Forum has been the guiding philosophy of President Reagan's foreign policy, peace through strength. But as this audience in particular knows too well, we gather today in a year unlike any in recent memory. The peace has been shattered. War has returned to Europe. But 2022 was also the year that forces of democracy showed incredible resilience, and Ukraine is now the front line of freedom. A few months ago, the Reagan Foundation was proud to announce that President Volodymyr Zelensky would receive the prestigious Ronald Reagan Freedom Award. And we look forward to the day we can present that in person in a free Ukraine. President Zelensky has become far more than the defender of his people. As President Reagan would have known, his nation's struggle is our struggle, and the struggle of people everywhere who cherish liberty and peace. And Europe is not the only place where peace is threatened. In the Indo-Pacific, tensions are rising again, and the specter of conflict in that region is looming. In this world of upheaval, the demand for peace through strength takes an even greater urgency. The importance of working with allies abroad and across the aisle at home has never been so critical. So I want to offer a special welcome to those joining us today from overseas. Defense Minister Kaikkonen of Finland, a new member of NATO, and Minister Ning from Singapore. We also welcome ambassadors from Finland, Singapore, Australia, Sweden, Norway, and Taiwan. Today's participants also represent what has come to define the Ronald Reagan National Defense Forum, an unwavering partnership across the aisle here at home. The speakers are of the stature that you've come to expect from the Defense Forum. We're pleased that Defense Secretary Austin has joined us again, and we're especially thrilled to have Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, the first DNI to join us at the Reagan Defense Forum. And on panels, you'll hear from a host of bipartisan leaders of Congress. It's often said that politics stops at the water's edge. And when it comes to national security, it seems to me that politics also stops at the entrance of the Reagan National Defense Forum. It's because transformational ideas like peace through strength transcend politics. They erase the red and blue lines we've drawn to divide ourselves. In his farewell address to the nation from the Oval Office that chilly January evening, President Reagan reflected on the new strategy that his administration had established for national defense, and he celebrated the achievements that have been made toward ending the Cold War. He offered us these words, and I quote, "The lesson of all of this was, of course, that because we're a great nation, our challenges seem complex. It will always be this way, but as long as we remember our first principles and believe in ourselves, the future will always be ours." Well, do Americans today remember these principles? Do we believe in ourselves? And can the future be ours? That is the question our first panel will take up. It's become our tradition here at the Forum to begin with the findings of our annual Reagan National Defense Survey. That way our conversations throughout the day are grounded in what the American people believe. So please welcome our first panelists, Co-Chair of the Defense Forum and House Armed Services Committee Chair Adam Smith, Senator Deb Fischer, Microsoft Vice Chair and President Brad Smith, political strategist Karl Rove, and moderator Abby Phillip of CNN. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good intro there. Careful.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning on this beautiful Saturday morning. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to be joined by these great panelists. We have a few recidivists here on the stage who've been a part of this panel before. Brad Smith, Chairman Smith, and Karl Rove have all been here. Senator Fischer, you and I are the newbies. But welcome to the very first session of this year's Reagan National Defense Forum. In recent years, as Fred noted, the forum has opened up with a discussion of this year's survey and the views of the American public, just to give us some perspective on defense and national security conversations that will take place throughout the day. This survey is now in its 5th year, and everyone where you are seated, you have received a pamphlet that includes the results of the survey, and you can also find it online. If you open up your RNDF app, there will be a link in the top right corner, a button in the top right corner that will take you to the results of the survey. I do want to start with our very first slide, which takes a look at this broad question that I think will guide a lot of our discussion, especially in light of the challenges that we face as a nation. This question asks about whether the United States, the American people, want more engagement, less engagement, or it depends. And as you can see in the numbers, the number that says they want the US to be more engaged has really gone down dramatically in the years since we've been doing this survey, since 2019, and now it's only at about 40%. But Karl, as you've noted, that number, those people have shifted not to they want us to be less engaged, but they've shifted over to the side saying that it depends.
Yeah.
And you've noted that that means, in large part, they are giving their political leaders a little bit of trust on this issue. It strikes me that as we sit here with Russia invading Ukraine, China eyeing Taiwan, that trust deposit is now coming due. And do you think the American leaders, political leaders at this moment, are adequately preparing the American public for what leadership on the world stage will need to look like in the coming years?
Well, I hope you're right that the doubling of the percentage of people who say depends is an acceptable sign. I'm not certain I agree with that. It makes me nervous. What's interesting is we go from 50% say more engagement 3 years ago to 40% today. That's a 10-point drop or a 20% decline in the percentage of people who say we want to be engaged. And as you say, they're not going to, less engaged, but being in depends may be a precursor to ending up in less engaged unless our leaders make it clear to people what the stakes are if America withdraws from the world stage. And you see this in a lot of questions in the poll, where people have an instinct that America needs to be engaged, like in Ukraine, but there's also a hint, more than a hint in a lot of places, that the American people's attitudes are becoming slightly more neo-isolationist. I looked at the crosstabs on this. What's interesting to me is look at the sources of strength for the percentage of people who say we ought to be more engaged. It's men, it's people 45 to 64, 65 plus, in fact, 51% of people 65 plus say we ought to be more engaged. It's college graduates, post-college graduates, of which they're fortunately only a small percentage of the American population, 52%. But the less are Republicans at 39, and the young. If you are under the age of 45, particularly if you're under the age of 30, you're significantly less likely to say more engaged. And you may be in the depends category, or you may be in the less engaged. But I worry that this is a precursor that we ought to pay attention to, and our leaders on both sides of the aisle need to figure out how to address.
At the same time that this trend is continuing, since everyone was gathered here at last year's forum, Russia did in fact invade Ukraine, and it really injected that issue into the forefront of the minds of Americans. And the survey this year asks about US support for Ukraine. And what we see in the survey is pretty robust support. Support for US military aid, support for US efforts to bolster Ukraine and bolster democracy abroad. And Senator Fisher, I wonder, as we are on the cusp of the Congress and the House side changing hands and Republicans coming into leadership after the midterm elections, do you expect that in Washington, especially on the Republican side, the Republican leadership will continue to demonstrate support for Ukraine, especially when it comes to military aid? The Biden administration asking now for $37 billion in additional aid for Ukraine.
I believe the American people have a good understanding of how important it is that America be a leader on the world stage, and that the world is a safer place when America is involved and does lead. I think that is shown by the amount of support we see, bipartisan support, that we see for Ukraine. But I also think, back to the first question, when it says, it depends. It depends. And I think the American people were war-weary with Afghanistan. I believe that was a tipping point on how we had the withdrawal out of Afghanistan, and I think it made the American people question more. And how do we address that as policymakers? I think we have to be honest. I think we have to be more transparent. I've been pushing the department to try to declassify some of the material that we see on the Armed Services Committee every day, all the classified briefings that we go through, because I think if the American people understand the threats that we face, then they will be more supportive of what we need to address those threats. That's then reflected in the budget that we accept. It is what we put into NDAA. And the American people will have an understanding when the House and Senate Armed Services Committee want to plus up that budget because of the needs that we see out there, and for certain programs whether it's putting the study in for Slickum to keep that in the budget, or a B-83 gravity bomb, to have the understanding on why that is needed. Because deterrence, I am a strong proponent of deterrence across many of the options that we present to a president in meeting the threats that we face. Deterrence is better than reacting after the fact.
I do want to get to the budget questions a little bit later. We'll return to it. But to kind of bridge this gap between Ukraine and China, just in the last 24 hours, you don't have to be here long to know China is really what is on everyone's mind. And in some ways, how the United States public has responded to the Ukraine crisis has become a little bit of a proxy for the coming conflict with China. And Chairman Smith, I wonder, do you think, what is your view of whether the American people will be prepared to do what is necessary to deter or confront China if it comes to that down the road?
Well, really, it's three things. And leading back to the first two questions. Number one, we cannot underestimate the 20 years of conflict between Iraq, Afghanistan, and what we used to call the global war on terror. America has been actively engaged militarily in the world in a way that most people in this country don't think was ultimately successful. We lost a lot of lives, it just disrupted it, and it sort of built in this feeling that America was too engaged in the wrong way in the world. Now, there's a lot that went into those decisions, okay? And it's easy in hindsight to say we should have done this or we shouldn't have done that. But I think when you're trying to figure out how do we get the American people to engage on a foreign policy and a national security policy that they can support, there's a certain amount of humility that every single one of us has to have in making that pitch. And that was 20 very, very difficult years. So we got to understand what our role is going to be in the world and emphasize that it's not even going to primarily be militarily. It's going to be about partnerships and alliances and development and diplomacy, that there are other ways to engage and bring the world together that don't just involve dropping bombs on people. And we need to make sure we make that balanced case, which is the second thing. We have to clearly articulate why we are engaged in the world. And I think that's the biggest problem. It's got different ideas over here. To me, it's crystal clear, which brings me to the third thing, and this is what Ukraine has done, is it has focused the mind. Prior to Russia invading Ukraine, a lot of the threat, as we got further and further away from 9/11, was sort of theoretical in the minds of most people. Oh, China's not going to invade Taiwan, Russia's not going to invade Ukraine. Now it's real. So now we have an opportunity to make the case to the American people, this is why we need to be engaged in the world. Because we stand, and I know it's almost cliche at this point, a rules-based international order that builds towards greater peace, greater stability, and greater security, not just for us, but for everybody. And on the other side of it is Xi and Putin and Iran and North Korea and a lot of global terrorist organizations who want autocracy, who want violence, who want to do. We need to work cooperatively, not America first, not we're the ones who are going to come in here and tell everyone else what to do, cooperatively with a large group of nations to build a better future for the world. We need to make that case, and I think that's the depends part. It depends on what you're doing. So if we can make that case and get the engagement, I think we can build support.
Yeah, I hate to be the worrywart here, but I agree with you. And take a look at this. In the poll, 82% of the American people feel that Russia is an enemy or something of an enemy. So we got 8 out of 10 people saying it's our enemy. And yet a third of the people say, you know what, we got enough problems at home, we shouldn't do more. And our leaders, I think you're right, need to make the case, not simply about, big nations attacking little nations and upsetting the international order, but we've got to make it clear to the American people that the interests of the American economy, the American worker, are at risk here.
Yeah, well, as you know, it's all about a narrative. That's what I'm going to tell you. If you're trying to win a campaign, you got to have a narrative. This is what everyone says after you lose a campaign. Oh, we didn't have a narrative. So a lot of people are saying that right now. But that's it. We have to build that larger narrative. And in part because there's been things going on domestically that have slightly distracted us, as we're all aware, we have to build that narrative.
I want to bring Brad Smith into the conversation on this Ukraine-Russia issue, because again, it's one of those moments where so much of what we are seeing happening on the ground in that conflict could foreshadow what is coming. And I know that Microsoft has been doing a lot of work on the ground in Ukraine, but also tracking a lot of the cyber activity and Russia's efforts to destabilize Ukraine, not just through bombs, but also through cyber incursions. Tell us more about what you all are seeing and what that can mean for other NATO nations, Poland, sort of almost a bystander in that conflict, but even the United States as we look further into the future.
I'd love to, and I'd put it maybe in the context of what we've been talking about so far. First of all, if you think about the question of the day, should people in the United States be worried enough about a war in Europe to want to do something to help Europe defend itself? This is not new. It was the question of the year in 1915. It was the question of the year in 1940. And I suspect if you had opinion polls from 1915 and 1940, we would see more support of the United States in 2022 than probably either of those 2 years. And I think that's a good thing, in part because of the principles that are at stake, but also because the geography and physics of the world have changed. And this, I think, is the connection to your question. For 200 years, we had the luxury of being separated from the world by 2 vast oceans. But when it comes to cyberspace and indeed outer space, that's irrelevant. When it comes to cyberspace, we're talking about weapons that literally move at the speed of light. And what we saw in Russia and Ukraine was a cyber war that began 12 hours before the kinetic war on the 23rd of February. Those were the first attacks that were unleashed, and they were first observed not in Kyiv, but in Redmond, Washington, because the nature of the internet and threat intelligence makes it possible to detect these things worldwide. And what we've seen, even in the last month, is evolving Russian tactics in this war. First, I think it's fair to say that the fundamental Russian strategy for the winter is to degrade, if they can, electricity in Ukraine to a point that becomes less tolerable for the Ukrainian population, that runs the risk of causing another flight of migration into Poland and elsewhere. And they are combining kinetic weapons with cyber weapons. So that's the first thing. The second thing we're seeing that I think deserves more attention than it has received so far is that at the same time that the whole world was talking about one errant missile that tragically killed 2 people in a farm, we detected and confirmed 6 cyber attacks launched by an arm of the Russian army, the GRU, against targets in Poland. Disguised as ransomware, what we call this prestige ransomware, that's how you create plausible deniability. But with technology, especially now with data and AI, we can trace this back to the source. And that kind of expansion, I think, should give us concern. And the third thing we're seeing is, I think, in some ways, perhaps the single area where I feel the Russians are the most sophisticated. It is the combination of not just military operations as we conventionally understand them, but we call cyber influence operations. The use of these campaigns, potentially, as we should be looking ahead to the winter, to try to degrade the very thing we're talking about here, public support for Ukraine. And that's an issue in the United States, but frankly, it is even a bigger issue in Poland, across Eastern Europe, in Germany. That's probably where the Russians, one might predict, will focus even more of their attention and energy.
And Chairman Smith, do you have a view on the country's preparedness for some of those challenges? The type of warfare that we could be seeing, that is both military and also cyber in nature. The American public, at least according to this survey, seems to be aware of that growing challenge, and our policymakers responding.
Yeah, a whole bunch of views on it, as a matter of fact. First of all, I mean, people tend to freak out that we're not prepared for things. I used to joke that when I first got in the Armed Services Committee, I thought that's what we did. People came over from think tanks in the Pentagon and described a threat to us. And you can be sure of several things. Number one, whatever we thought the threat was, we were crazy underestimating it. If you thought we were ready, there's no way we were ready. It was just like freaking people out. So I'm not a fan of that approach. Figure out what the problem is, and let's figure out how we can address it. But I think when you look at the military, and Mac Thornberry is here, and he was a great leader on this before anybody else was, recognizing the change in the nature of warfare, how important information systems and technology are, what they now JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control Awareness, basically making sure all of our systems communicate, and those information systems that Brad just talked about are protected. We need better information systems. And then what you're seeing in Ukraine, you need better missiles, better drones, and better missile defense, and better counter-drone capability. We need to make investments in those technologies to be in a better position to fight the fights that are out there right now. That's the part most people agree with, but then we get into the whole debate over legacy systems. And by the way, I've got nothing against legacy systems if they are helpful to what we need to do right now. Okay? Just because it's old doesn't mean it doesn't work anymore. The older I get, the more I believe in that statement. But the point is, you need to look at what is the fight. And the fight, what we're learning in Ukraine is, again, got to have the best information systems, got to be able to get the information where it needs to go, got to be able to protect it, which brings us back up into space in a major way. And we've got to make those investments, and then missiles, counter missiles. And if you're building a lot of, well, final point. We used to have a very simple formulation, which was we have to be able to mass a whole lot of firepower in the place where we need it, which means big ships, planes. But now that firepower, as big as it is, as we've seen, is incredibly vulnerable to a very cheap missile, okay? So what do we actually need to build? We need to pivot to the asymmetric warfare that is now happening around those issues. And we are, I will say, and I think the Pentagon, through 3 administrations, should mention, I always think of Ash Carter as one of the first people who sort of had a vision of this, and incredibly sad his passing this year, but he was a real leader, and that continued through 3 administrations to try to make this transition to that type of warfare. But that's what we need to do to be in a position to deter the adversaries that we face. China being the big one. We've done the Office of Net Assessment has done a whole bunch of war games about how we weren't ready for it. We then built a plan and said, okay, well, what would it look like if we were ready? And what it would look like is a lot of those things that we just laid out, and we need to start investing in them and building them.
According to the survey, 85% of Americans say that cyber warfare is among their top concerns. So the concern is there. The interesting thing in the last couple of years, Senator Fisher, has been, I think Americans are experiencing, some things that might have seemed esoteric in the past, let's say a chip shortage, and experiencing it incredibly acutely. And just as we pivot a little bit to this issue of China, it's really highlighted how dependent we are on technology that is made elsewhere. And I know that on a bipartisan basis, lawmakers passed the CHIPS Act, and there is a fair amount of bipartisan praise for that. But I think my question to you is, what's next? What else can be accomplished on a bipartisan basis that addresses a broad range of concerns, not just about military readiness, but about our economic readiness to compete with China?
I think it's extremely important that we recognize that our adversaries didn't take a break when we did, and I'm speaking about our military readiness because that is a focus for me. They didn't take a break. We didn't make the investments. They kept investing. The Chinese have some good stuff, but they're making better things faster. And we continue to be behind. And we are not making the investments. Yes, the theater of war is going to change. And it puts, I think, more of a challenge on this country to be able to address what we will be seeing in the future. And when you don't put the funding into research, don't put the funding into making sure that you can move ahead on plans faster, we fall further and further behind. We've all heard the Chinese say they're going into Taiwan by 2027. Well, we have things that can be able to mitigate that. That may not be ready till 2030. The Chinese aren't just going to do military, as you said. They are an economic strength power. Other countries are worried about that, as everyone should be, on what can happen. We saw when Lithuania, for example, they've made some overtures to Taiwan. Well, what did China do? They had a de facto embargo on Lithuania then, and caused economic upheaval. When we look at Ukraine, when we're looking at a country that, about 45% of their economic vitality has dropped because of this war, that is just as important. It is just as vital for that country to be able to fight back or work with allies to be able to get through that in this long war that we are going to see in Ukraine. So I agree, we have to establish and keep strong relationships with our allies. We need to be able to step up and provide what's needed. But I think many times it's easier to look past the basic military needs that we have in this country because we feel that warfare will change. My point is, yes, warfare will change, but we have to have the basic military needs met.
The politics is at the doors of the Reagan National Defense Forum, but it is actually a kind of bipartisan agreement, at least in the last 2 years, that Congress has given the Defense Department more than the Biden administration has asked for.
We've worked really well on that with the House Armed Services Committee, with the Senate Armed Services Committee. There's been, I think, a good working relationship, a good partnership to be able to address those needs and maybe put a little more pressure on the White House, on any administration. That is our job. That is our job, to be able to work with any administration that comes forward and push back when need be.
Chairman Smith, I mean, why is it that the Congress has repeatedly had to plus up the defense appropriations in the last couple of years?
The last couple of Congresses, well, it's not terribly complicated, actually. You know, the White House is also very concerned about the non-defense portion of the budget, and it's always a negotiation. It's going on right now. You know, so it's part of the negotiating approach to how we get to a final appropriations deal on that. But also, I think that the White House and on the D side, you know, we don't believe that you should just spend more money. I mean, a lot of times I get these requests, we got to plus it up by $20 billion. And you ask the question, well, what would you like to spend it on? Well, we just got to plus it up by $20 billion. I'm really kind of focused on where do you spend it? Because you can spend money in a way that is not positive. I always quote, there's a VC that I've worked with who said, he has not yet met the organization that can't have its budget cut by 10% and get better at what it does. I said that to Secretary Austin. He didn't think much of that comment, by the way, just in case you're wondering. So, and I'm not suggesting that we cut the Pentagon by 10%. I am suggesting that we don't just throw money at them, that we pay a little bit of attention to where it goes.
I want to pivot a little bit to another portion of the survey that has in recent days, you've probably seen, gotten a little bit more attention. It has to do with how the American people have confidence in our institutions. And the military remains one of the most trusted institutions, but a plurality say in this survey, Carl, that they are concerned about military leadership. Republicans largely drive this, concerns about so-called woke ideologies. This was actually asked in the survey. And, you know, as I read this, I mean, as a political journalist, it's not new to me, this idea, but it was striking to me how it has penetrated into at least some sections of the American population, particularly Republicans. But my question to you is this real, or is this just a reflection of partisanship that suddenly about a third of Americans say they're concerned about woke ideologies penetrating military leadership?
Yeah, well, look, we're in a secular period where confidence in all our public institutions has been dropping. So you could sort of say, oh, well, we don't need to worry about this because it's part of a bigger problem. We solve the bigger problem. We solve the problem of confidence in the military. That's not what this survey says, though. If you take a look at it, it asks what has decreased your confidence in the military. Three things stick out. 34% of the people say it is the performance of our commanders. 34% say it is overly politicized, and 30% say because it's got too much wokeism in there. And what's interesting is, if you look at these, they all have sort of similar groups that are above the average. That is to say, the groups that are driving this sentiment. Men, people age 45 to 64, Hispanics and Republicans all say that it's performance of our military commanders and our political leadership. Overly politicized, men, 45 to 64-year-olds, 65-year plus, postgraduates, and Republicans, starting to see a pattern here. Woke, men, 45 to 64, everybody, 65-year plus, college graduates, postgraduates, and Republicans. So we've got an element out there that's saying, in essence, we like the military, but we've got growing concerns about things that are diminishing our confidence in them. And this needs to be addressed by policy leaders, in my opinion.
It needs to be addressed by policy or politics?
Well, look.
Should be policy.
Yeah, it should.
Well, what is the policy prescription to fix that?
Well, I'm not certain I have the exhaustive list, but for example, going back to what Adam was talking about, what the chairman and the senator were talking about, yeah, okay, great. We've got great leadership, bipartisan in both houses, bicameral, that says we're going to plus up the military budget. But maybe we need the administration to be saying we need to plus up the military budget as well. I think the attitude of the White House tends to be, you know what, this is taken care of by Deb and Adam, so we can send in a soft number. And that's not a good sign. We need to have the president, supported by Republicans and Democrats alike, making the case for why America's military is in a precarious place in the dangerous world that we're living in, and that we need to, as a country, put more importance into military spending and improving our military. And my suspicion is we'd see some of these numbers change if there were some policy changes. You know, it was not helpful, I think, to say, I think it was the second paragraph of the budget submission on defense that said, look at all the money we're putting into climate. Second paragraph. May have been the first, but it was right near the top. And those kind of things, the administration saying, okay, don't worry, Chairman Smith, Senator Fisher are going to take care of this problem, send them a low number. That kind of thing is emblematic of an attitude that's not helpful to solving the problem that this poll says we have.
Well, I should say...
I'm sorry, look, it's perfectly fair to say, and I should have said this in the answer to the first question, look, within the Democratic Party, there is less support for spending a lot more money on the defense budget. So if you're a Democratic president, you're factoring that in when you're figuring out how to send the budget up. And we have to build a better narrative for why spending money on defense actually does make sense. Now, Ukraine is helping, because your survey also shows that Democrats support helping Ukraine more than Republicans do. And that's starting to have an impact on that. I mean, I had an interesting meeting with a left-leaning group that their first request was, we have to give Ukraine everything that they want, and their second request was, we have to cut the defense budget. And I was like, you know, those two things, so we got to make that case better.
One of the big themes...
And we have that we need to increase the defense budget, but we need more oversight on the spending for Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'm
sorry, but the whole oversight of the spending on Ukraine thing makes me a little crazy for two reasons. Number one, the focus on that is part of Russian propaganda. All these stories about how the money isn't being spent wisely, it's going all over the place, it's coming, and Brad, maybe because
let's have Brad
monitor the whole thing. Second, Ukraine is spending the money really well. That's why they're winning, okay? So I think yes, we need oversight, but we don't need that as an excuse to not fund what we're doing.
So
I want
Brad,
to, in a moment of bipartisanship, join with you heartily in this. I just wish the 7 years that I spent in the White House, the members of your party had the same attitude about the global war on terrorism spending, because we spent a lot of time fending off or dealing with oversight requests and blah, 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 blah.
I'm sorry, but I think the Ukrainians are spending it a little bit better. I'm
Yeah,
just going to go ahead and say that.
Let me interject here.
I agree with you, but the principle still remains the same. It's a pain in the ass.
It is.
Let me interject here because a big theme, I do want to stay on this for a moment, because a big theme in this survey has been this question of there's a real unease in the American public about what is going on domestically. And it shows up in two places. The first, just simply asking them, where are the biggest threats coming from? 40% say from within, more than any other category, more than from outside, more than say both from within and outside. 40% say the biggest threat is coming from within, and a lot of Americans in this survey are also saying that they're concerned about political divisions leading to violence, political divisions domestically leading to a lack of security for the United States. Brad, the part of this that I want to ask you about is on the disinformation piece, because Americans seem very aware that disinformation is a part of the ecosystem. They're aware of it, they believe that foreign governments are trying to influence them. And you've seen this happening just in the last few months in Ukraine as well, where Russia has been planting narratives about inflation and about energy in European markets. So what is coming for Americans, and how do we get ahead of this challenge?
Well, first, I think it's just important to recognize how critical it is. And I think one of the most interesting things about this year's survey is that the question was asked. And lo and behold, once you ask the question, you get this reflection from people that the divisions within are a great concern. I think it connects very quickly to fundamental questions about how to manage this issue societally. In a democracy, I think that the role of the government is inherently limited whenever you're talking about the free debate that you need a country to pursue. And I think for lots of good reasons, people have oftentimes just as many concerns about the role of tech companies as they do about the government itself. And so I look at it and say what we need to do, I'll just approach it from our industry's perspective, is two things. One is stay true to the values that have long been important here, namely free expression, and a recognition that censorship is not the answer. Instead, the answer to ideas that we think are bad or information that we think is flawed, I think is always to provide people with what we hope are better ideas and more and better information. And this then connects directly with what I think we're doing, certainly as a company, where you see the sector start to go. The biggest risk, in my view, is the feeding of divisions within from cyber influence operations from without, specifically the Russians and the Chinese, to some degree the Iranians, but the Russians are the most prolific. The Chinese have the greatest capabilities in this space. And just as in some ways, the first step in defending against all what I'd call traditional cyber attacks is to detect them. We are and need to hone our ability to detect these kinds of, say, Russian and Chinese cyber influence operations. And one of the great lessons, I think, of 2022 was, in some ways, perhaps historians will say, the single most important thing that the United States government did was release its intelligence so that people in Europe would be forewarned about what was coming. And in the same way, we have the opportunity to take our intelligence and our threat detection, and just as we attribute a ransomware attack in Poland to the Russian military, identify, report, and attribute these kinds of efforts to, say, the Russian military, the Chinese government, and the like. And then we at least have a foundation for a media-savvy and informed debate. And that will never solve every problem, but I also always think it is the fundamental foundation in every democracy for trying to keep the public together.
And as Chairman Smith was referring to, this debate over oversight on Ukraine funding, it strikes me is very much driven by a lot of online conversation, by a lot of cable news conversation. And I don't know if Senator Fisher, you want to jump in on that, but do you think that that in the new Congress, that issue of wanting to curtail Ukraine funding is going to dominate?
I think the challenge before us as policymakers, first of all, is to involve our colleagues in more classified briefings, in trying to gather more information so that they are informed and they don't buy into a lot of noise that's going on out there. Secondly, I go back to the fact that we have to be more transparent with the American people so that they can filter through the barrage of information that they receive, and that they then are better able, more capable of discerning for themselves what the truth is on information. It's not going to, I don't think it's going to change minds on one side or the other for us to sit up here and say, this is what you should believe, this is what is happening. People have to have access to enough information out there, to enough solid news, the Walter Cronkite news, the solid news, to be able to make their own decisions with the facts that they have, so that they can do that. And as policymakers, we need to be careful of the rhetoric that we use in speaking to our constituents and to be more honest with them.
Chairman Smith, do you expect that the NDA will be approved this year and that there will be an omnibus spending bill approved this year as well?
Yeah, again, just one quick thing on the messaging piece. Brad hit it quite well. We need to get our message out there, and that sort of brings me back to that original point about we need to tell our story. And I think one of the things I've been really worried about, and Mac and I worked on this a lot when he was chair as well, the Smith-Mont Act. That's an inside joke, I won't get into that. But we've got to get our message out, okay? And I think what happens, during the course, and the Russians are doing all this and the Chinese are doing all this, I really agree with the Senator and Brad on this. It's like when you're running a campaign, they're running TV ads against us, they're doing those, okay, well, we have money and we have access to that too. Let's get our message right, and then let's get out there and let's start doing it. I think we have been slow for a variety of different reasons to develop and deliver that message as to what is our narrative about U.S. engagement in the world and the vision we have for that. And I think we need to be a lot more aggressive about putting it out there, and that is the best way to counteract what Russia and China and other people are doing. To answer your question, yes, we will pass the NDAA.
And I ask because,
yes.
Because the kind of broader questions about whether these funding decisions should be deferred into the new Congress, that is going to be weeks. We need to do our job, and this is a source of enormous frustration for me, so I'll try to, but we need to pass the defense bill, and we need to pass the appropriations bills. And there's all these insane conversations going on about, well, why don't we do that? Okay, it's great. Pass the defense bill, pass the appropriations bill. And you can do all that other stuff over there if you can, but if you can't, let's just do those two things and get them done. We are planning on filing the bill on Monday. There are a fair number of people who are trying to stand in the way of that, but as the Lord is my witness, we will file the bill on Monday, and we will vote, and we will pass it this week, one way or the other. And we need to do... And we need to do the same thing in the appropriations bill. I'll just make one point that I've made to a lot of people. I think part of what gets us in trouble is we wait so long to start. And this is like my mantra for the last couple of years. I think it's a Sound of Music thing. The beginning is a very good place to start. And when you say, well, we can't sit down and negotiate because we don't know about this and we don't know about that. Well, that's why you're sitting down to negotiate. So you can get to the point where you do know about this and that. We wait and we wait and we wait and we do press releases and we do all this other BS. Sit down and start talking and start working it out.
okay? And then you'll work out, you got 100% of things to work out. Okay, here's the 20 that you don't think you're ever gonna be able to work out. Well, get the first 80 done. And then you can focus on that 20. We need to start the process on appropriations, all this stuff earlier, and that is my plea for the Senate to pass the defense bill, well, period, but before August. Would be great, because then we could get in negotiations and we wouldn't be sitting here in December wondering if we're going to get there. Sorry, that's just personal.
The failure of Congress to pass the budget for the biggest enterprise in the world in a timely fashion is one of the reasons why the public does not have as much confidence in Congress and Washington as it should. And the efforts to get this in place and get it done is really critical to starting a long process of restoring confidence. People have watched this circus for years, and they see it as a circus. I commend you on your efforts, and by God, I hope you get both Ukraine funding and NDAA and a budget in place, because this is not how the world should work, and certainly not how our government should work.
There is, I mean, I think clearly there's reasonable disagreements between the two sides on the approach to policy on a lot of this stuff. But I wonder, Carl, what you think about where we are on the rhetoric. There's so much agreement here in this room and on this stage on a lot of different things, but the rhetoric out there that is taken in by the American public and fed back to our lawmakers is very extreme. What can be done about that?
Well, I've got a crackpot theory that the country's getting fed up. And we're at a point where a couple of things are going to happen. And we've seen it start to happen in these two different bodies. Last year, 3 major pieces of legislation were passed, not because the White House made it a priority, but because Republicans and Democrats said, you know what, screw it, we're going to get it done. We had John Cornyn and Murphy of Connecticut say the Uvalde killing is going to cause, the massacre in Uvalde is going to cause us to do something on guns. We had a freshman Republican from Indiana and a senior Democrat from Virginia say, you know what, we have a shared concern about us being too dependent upon foundries in Taiwan, on which the semiconductors, the new energy of the world depends, so we want to do something about chips. And then we had the Republicans and Democrats on the Senate Transportation Committee say, we got to reauthorize the Highway Trust Fund, as we do every 5 years. And while we're at it, why don't we see if we can't agree upon a reasonable amount of money for long-term investment in infrastructure that will make our country stronger economically. And all 3 of these things happen not because the White House said these are priorities and the president gives an address and we send our legislation up. It happened because members of Congress said, you know what, we're done. We're done with trying to get on cable news. We're tired of the food fights. Let's get something done. And I think that's happening. I think the other thing that's happening is, it's, whether we know it or not, it's 1959 or 1960. We have Dwight D. Eisenhower, an admirable person as our president, but he was born before the turn of the century. He was born in the 19th century. And the American people said in that year, thank you, appreciate your leadership for our country, but we want to pick one of these 40-year-olds who's a veteran of the Pacific Theater, Richard Nixon and JFK, and for the next 32 years, we were governed by the greatest generation. And then along came 1992, and people said, you know what, we appreciate all you've done for the saving civilization and making America great, but we're going to turn it over to the baby boomers. And we're now at the end of a 32-year period of that. And so I think what's going to happen is that both of these things are going to break the logjam in Washington, make it A, more constructive, and B, mean maybe some new faces in 2024, because, I travel a lot, and people come up to me in the airport and say, where's the damn whiteboard? And, but they also say, is this the best we can do? And what happened in these 2 chambers last year with these bills says to me it's starting to move in the Congress as well. And the attitude that you saw exemplified here today by a Republican senator and a Democratic House member, I think is emblematic of that as well.
I'm sorry, I agree with most of that. President Biden deserves a lot more credit for all that stuff that happened. That's the only thing I'll say. I think having a president who is a legislator, who believes in getting things done, really helped. Yes, all those other people helped too, but don't think we can dismiss the White House for all the legislation that got done in the last 2 years. I think President Biden,
he signed the bill, so he gets credit. But I remember
he did a lot more than just sign.
I remember how many times he said, "Don't move the infrastructure bill because I want to get Build Back Better," and the House and Senate moved the infrastructure bill in spite of it. particularly.
It is interesting to have a debate about who should get credit rather than who should get blame. I mean,
That's
that is
true.
a step in the
That
right
is true.
direction.
I'll take it. I think that's
America, yes.
steered in a positive direction. I do want to refocus us a little bit back to the sort of overarching theme for, I think, a lot of the conversations today. We've got a war in Europe, but a looming conflict in Asia. And I think a big question for all of you, and you can marinate on this in your individual ways, is as we sit here today, do our political leaders have the ability to mobilize public opinion and political will to actually face the challenge that is coming, which would be a conflict with China? So, Senator Fisher, my question to you is, given all the divisions that are in our society, do you believe that when the moment comes and an American president, whoever that is, has to go to the American people and say, this is what we need to do to combat China today, whether it is force or transferring weapons or doing something else vis-a-vis Taiwan, that they would be able to do it?
I'm a pretty positive person, and I believe in the American spirit, and so I think we would be able to, but it just can't all of a sudden come out of the blue. We just can't look at the American people and say, China's bad, we need to do this. That's why we have to message. We have to be able to explain to the American people the threats we have. We have to decide who we are as a country and be able to come together and provide support for whoever the president would be at the time in order to face those challenges. If we can start now, if we can tie all that together, I believe the people of this country have always stepped forward when needed, and they would do so again.
And Carl, the survey found that there's a lot of American support for political responses to the threat of China in potentially invading Taiwan, but that support drops pretty dramatically when you start asking them about things like sending military equipment or a no-fly zone or ground troops. Does that limit the U.S. policy options?
Well, these are questions asked in the abstract, and we see a different side of this when we look at Ukraine, because their events, have sort of driven the American people into a position of support because they've seen it play out. The old saw, events are in the saddle and ride mankind, and events in Ukraine have done that. We've seen presidential leadership in the form of the Ukrainian president that has inspired the world, and the acts of the Ukrainian people have been enormously inspirational. What's interesting to me is the survey shows a lot of concern about China. Not as much concern about China as Russia, and you might expect that because right now we see the battle in Ukraine, but a lot of concern and growing concern about China. And again, I don't think it's because, and then there's a bipartisan consensus. There's not a political divide in this survey on China. And I think, again, events are driving it because we see China and hear about China and its authoritarian methods, and the American people have a gut instinct, a gut response to it that's very positive. And how political leaders can use that, draw on it in order to craft a bipartisan approach to China is I think, there. To me, one of the interesting things is that one of the number one issues in the survey is a concern about the theft of American intellectual property, and why we have not had, and now in 2 administrations in a row, a high-profile, concerted, bipartisan effort diplomatically drawing on countries around the world. The Germans certainly don't like their intellectual property being stolen, or the French or whomever. Why there hasn't been 2 presidents in a row, both of whom are concerned about China, who've led such an international effort to clamp down on these practices, is beyond me. But the survey says the American people are ready for leadership against China because they've already made their decision about China as they've made a decision about Russia.
Brad, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, yeah, and I think the real question, in my view, is do we have the political leadership that can address the biggest challenges we need to address so that we are prepared for whatever comes? And I just think from a technology perspective, there's three categories. First, we constantly need to renew the country's technological base. We have this enormous asset of, fundamentally the strongest, most innovative private sector. But one of the biggest political advances, I believe, this year, the one we're not talking about, was the piece in the CHIPS Act that creates a new technology directorate of the National Science Foundation, authorizes more than $5 billion of research for quantum information sciences, cybersecurity, 5G, 10 different fields, and then will flow that money through the nation's universities to renew that part of the innovation base. The second thing we need to do is obviously get the kind of supply chain security that we will need to confront any new kind of threat. We would just be so weakened if we faced the threat of an imminent war without the ability to manufacture what we need. That is underway. It's underway in the private sector. The Congress, government is providing resources to help in the CHIPS Act, putting some political pressure. It is a years-long endeavor, not months-long, and we're probably, in my view, not talking enough about the fact that you can't really just bring the entire supply chain back to one country. This, too, is an area where we need to have an alliance. And then the third great challenge is to take all of this technology and figure out how it can be harnessed in military applications. And in my view, the part of the conversation that deserves more attention is what it fundamentally means for procurement writ large. I would argue that from a technological perspective, almost every weapon is one of two things. It's either a jet or a jeep. And what do I mean by that? The jet was invented by the military, the P-38. The American public didn't even know about it until it had flown 100 flights. And it took more than a decade to go from military use to commercial aviation. The Jeep was invented in 8 days when the US Army in 1940 said it would need a four-wheel drive vehicle for a war in Europe, and American automakers created a prototype using off-the-shelf applications. The Cold War was won with jets, but now we need a lot more Jeeps. And we have the world's smartest people working with a procurement system that I think was fundamentally designed for the creation of jets in the 1950s. And if we could just step back and get out of all of the gobbledygook, because there's so much, and ask, how do you build a world to get more Jeeps moving from, say, the tech sector into the military at the speed that the Jeep literally did in 1940? Then we will be prepared the way we need to be.
And to your second point, there's a very interesting question in the survey about what Americans believe will lead to the next conflict. And the vast majority of Americans say it's traditional things like fossil fuels, coal, and other energy sources. 68%, though, say it'll be new commodities like semiconductors and other advanced technologies. And as someone said to me yesterday, chips are the new oil. So getting Americans to understand that might be the next challenge. Chairman Smith, I'll give you the last word. What's next for you in your mind? What should be next on the agenda for Congress to tackle to best position this country for the challenges of the future?
Well, actually, I think the big one is what Brad was talking about there. And actually, I don't know, 6 months ago or so now, there was an article in Foreign Affairs magazine that basically said, the Pentagon was built to run like the Ford Motor Company in the 1950s. It needs to be built to run like Apple in 2022. And making that transition towards what Brad just described, be able to get off-the-shelf stuff, to be able to take advantage of new innovative technologies quickly. I would say when it comes to us being able to build the defense that we need, to have the deterrence that we need, nothing is more important than that. Whether it's, we don't know whether to build this ship or that missile or whatever, but building the system that can get us to embrace those technologies in that way, that is the most important transition that we need to make to be able to deter. And then back on the messaging point, when you said, can political leaders stand up to the American people and say, China's a threat? No, not just one political leader. We have the democratization of power now. In order to build that national consensus and coalition around engaging in the world and deterring a place like China, we need to use all of the levers out there. And the corporate world is going to be a key part of that, an amazing asset for the U.S. to have, some of the best companies, the innovative universities. It's going to have to be collective. It's not one person dictating where it goes. We've got to build that support from the ground up. And I'll agree with the senator's optimism. I think the country's ready for that. I think part of the problem is democracies are messy, okay? They just are, because everyone gets to say something. Whenever I'm pulling the defense bill together at the end, it's like, I wish I could just say, okay, this is what we're doing, leave me alone. But that doesn't work as well, okay? It doesn't. It's better when you bring in more voices, but you also have to get comfortable with a certain amount of discord. It's not the end of the world, okay? We're going to argue and fight. You're not going to get exactly what you want. That's okay. We're going to get through it, and I think we will. I do think that we have the ability to pull people together, that we have the leadership, not just in politics, but in the business world and elsewhere, to really build that consensus and play the role that I think the U.S. has to play right now.
Well, thank you all for joining us for this great discussion, and there might be discord elsewhere, but not so much on this stage for the most part. So thank you all very much, Brad Smith, Chairman Adam Smith, Karl Rove, and Senator Deb Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.